You've seen the footage. The crowds in the square, faces lit by fire and phone screens, the chants, the flags, the promise that this time it will be different. It never is. Revolutions begin with purity, a shared sense of injustice. The system is corrupt, the leaders are liars, and the people are ready to reclaim control. In the beginning, everything feels clear. There's a target, a cause, and a moral high ground. But the clarity doesn't last. As the old regime falls, something darker rises to replace it. The faces change, but the structure doesn't. Surveillance, propaganda, control. They return under new banners. Dissent becomes treason again. Power doesn't disappear. It migrates. You don't have to look far. Lenin became Stalin. The French guillotined their kings and crowned their own terror. Anti-colonial leaders expelled their oppressors, then ruled just as violently. The slogans shift. The boots stay on your neck. This isn't cynicism, it's a pattern. The more brutal the revolution, the more brutal the rule that follows. And not because revolutions fail, but because they succeed. They clear the stage for new actors to perform the same play. The same script, different names. It's not that power corrupts, it's that power reveals. And once someone tastes it, they start using the very tools they swore to destroy. Secret police, rigged courts, censorship disguised as protection. The idealists either become tyrants or get buried by them. Michel Foucault didn't call power a prize. He called it a current. It doesn't sit, it moves. It flows through systems, through speech, through silence. You don't win it, you join its rhythm. And if you're not careful, it speaks through you. So the question isn't why revolutions fail. The question is why they always end up building the very thing they hated. Why does every cry for freedom echo back as control? Why do the oppressed, once in power, become indistinguishable from their former oppressors? And if revolutions don't change the game, just the players, what does? Let's look closer. History doesn't repeat. It obeys. Patterns, not poetry. The idea of revolution has always carried a sacred weight. Men standing against kings, citizens rising against empires, the many pushing back against the few. It looks like justice. And sometimes, in its early moments, it is. But justice rarely survives power. The French Revolution began with liberty, fraternity, and equality. Within 5 years, it gave way to guillotines in the public square. The Committee of Public Safety outlawed dissent, rebranded fear as loyalty, and executed anyone who questioned the revolution's purity. Robespierre didn't become a tyrant by accident. He believed terror was necessary to protect the cause. He meant well, that's the problem. You see the same arc in Russia. The Bolsheviks promised a workers' paradise. Lenin offered bread, land, and peace. Stalin delivered purges, famine, and secret prisons, not because he betrayed the revolution, but because he fulfilled it in its purest form. Remove the opposition, control the narrative, protect the revolution at all costs. Once those rules are accepted, tyranny isn't a bug. It's the system functioning as designed. Power doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's shaped by culture, fear, trauma, and opportunity. And when old systems collapse, people don't suddenly become free. They become desperate. Order becomes seductive. And in that vacuum, the most ruthless rise first. They move fast, speak in absolutes, and offer safety disguised as structure. Philosophers have warned about this for centuries. Plato saw it in the cycle of regimes, democracy devolving into tyranny as the people grow tired of chaos and hand power to a strong man. Machiavelli, more honest than most, admitted that to hold power you must be feared more than loved. And Foucault stripped the illusion entirely. He said power isn't owned. It circulates. You don't seize it. You become a conduit. You embody the structure. It's not about leaders, it's about systems. The revolution removes the monarch but leaves the throne, and someone always sits in it. The architecture of control is rarely dismantled. It's repainted. The surveillance becomes national security. The censorship becomes public health. The prisons get new names. The rules stay the same. What makes this pattern hard to break is that every generation believes theirs will be different. They believe they're smarter, more righteous, less corruptible. But the structure doesn't care. Power doesn't ask if you're good. It asks if you'll play, and most do. That's why revolutions become regimes. Why rebels become rulers. Why the story always ends the same. Not because people are weak, but because systems are stronger than belief. Ask most people what a revolution is, and they'll tell you it's a reset, a cleansing, a breaking of chains. It's the people rising up, tearing down corrupt leaders, and reclaiming control over their future. They think of revolutions as moments of moral clarity. The good against the evil. The powerless finally standing tall. History tends to agree, at least in its most popular retellings. Schoolbooks frame revolutions as heroic. Movies make them feel cinematic. But these are surface-level stories. They focus on symbols, not systems. The surface of any revolution looks noble. Flags are raised, statues fall, dictators are dragged through the streets. Crowds cheer as if evil itself has been defeated. But beneath that celebration, something quieter is happening. A scramble for control, a vacuum forming, and a group of new actors waiting in the wings, ready to pick up the same tools the old regime used to rule. People miss this because they want to believe in clear endings. They want to believe that toppling a government resets the game, that new leaders mean new values, that the machinery of power somehow rewires itself overnight. It doesn't. The state remains. The police force doesn't disappear. The intelligence networks are still intact. The weapons don't vanish. The bureaucrats still know how to file reports. The media infrastructure, the economic levers, the laws, all of it stays in place. What changes is who pulls the strings. And often the new hands are just as eager to grip tightly. Part of the illusion is emotional. People are so relieved to see the old power fall, they don't look closely at what replaces it. Hope acts like anesthesia, and by the time they feel the cut, it's too late. The new government speaks the language of freedom but moves like the last one. It silences dissent in the name of unity. It restricts speech in the name of peace. It consolidates control in the name of protection. To the public, it still looks like progress. For a while. Because in the early days, revolutions are careful. They perform morality. They hold public trials. They publish manifestos. But once stability is threatened, once protests return or a rival faction appears, that mask slips. Emergency powers are declared. Enemies of the people are named. And the same cycle begins again. You see it across eras. Mao's China promised liberation from imperialism. It delivered mass surveillance, re-education camps, and millions dead in the name of purity. Iran's 1979 revolution replaced a Western-backed dictator with a theocratic regime that polices thought and jails dissent. Cuba's rebels ousted a corrupt Batista, only to install decades of state censorship, travel restrictions, and secret police. Each movement began with promises of justice. Each ended with institutions that could not tolerate challenge. That's not failure, it's design. Because the public face of revolution is just that, a face. What happens behind it is a reorganization of power. And more often than not, it's not the best ideas that win. It's the most ruthless ones. So when people talk about revolution like it's a cure, they're missing the disease. The disease isn't just the people in charge, it's the structure that allows anyone to control so much, so absolutely in the first place. That's the surface most never question, and until they do, they'll keep cheering the fall of one tyrant, while unknowingly applauding the rise of the next. The mistake is thinking revolutions are about replacing bad people. They're not. They're about seizing infrastructure. The core of any regime, old or new, isn't made of speeches or slogans. It's made of systems, intelligence networks, communication controls, police forces, tax collection, surveillance, bureaucracy, and borders. These systems don't vanish in revolution. They're inherited. And the new leadership quickly learns what the last one already knew. These tools are necessary if you want to stay in power. There's a gravitational pull to centralized control. Once you're inside it, you feel the logic. You see threats everywhere. You hear dissent differently. It no longer sounds like debate. It sounds like danger. So you justify. You rationalize. You do what the previous regime did, just under new language. It's not ideological failure, it's structural momentum. Systems don't care about your intentions. A surveillance state doesn't know if it's watching citizens for freedom or order. A propaganda engine doesn't care if it's pushing a king's message or a revolutionary's. The machine works the same either way. Plug in a different operator and it keeps humming. Power, once centralized, moves predictably. First, it protects itself. Then it expands its reach, and eventually it begins to shape the people beneath it. not through brute force alone, but through normalization. Rules become culture. Fear becomes etiquette. People learn what not to say. They self-censor. They adapt. The architecture of tyranny isn't built overnight. It's reactivated. Quietly. Efficiently. With full public support, at least in the beginning. Because the early days of any new regime always promise peace. What they deliver is control. Usually in increments. This is why revolutions repeat. Not because of bad luck or bad actors, but because the underlying structure remains untouched. You can change the guard as often as you like. If the prison stays intact, so does the captivity. And very few revolutions ever dismantle the structure. Because doing so requires more than courage. It requires restraint. It requires letting go of the very tools that guarantee your dominance. And most leaders won't do that. Not when they've just fought to hold those tools in their hands. The deeper truth is this. Revolutions are not the opposite of regimes. They're often the fuel that keeps regimes alive. They refresh the story. They repaint the machinery. They convince the public that real change has occurred. And then slowly the same dynamics return. Obedience, fear, silence dressed up as unity. The structure doesn't need a king. It just needs someone willing to sit in the chair and keep the levers moving. That's what power counts on. Not ideology, not morality, but compliance with the system's logic. And once you see that, it's harder to cheer when the next banner is raised, because you've seen what's behind it, and you know what comes next. Most people don't want to believe any of this. They've grown up on stories where revolution means freedom, where the bad guys fall and the good guys take over, where history bends toward justice if enough people march, chant, and vote the right way. To question that narrative feels disloyal, disillusioned, even dangerous. But the resistance to truth isn't just emotional. It's survival-based. People need meaning. They need to believe the sacrifices mattered, that the lives lost in protest weren't traded for another mask of the same face. If you admit the revolution became a regime, you risk admitting the fight didn't lead where you thought it would. That's not an easy story to carry. There's also fear. Not just of speaking out, but of what you might have to do next if you admit what's real. If the system didn't change, then your job isn't done. But after decades of hope, fatigue sets in. It's easier to believe progress happened than to accept that the structure absorbed the revolution and kept going. Cognitive dissonance does the rest. People defend the new regime because it represents their side, their team, their suffering. So they excuse the early warning signs. The censorship isn't oppression, it's protection. The arrests aren't silencing, they're stability. The surveillance isn't tyranny, it's transparency. This is how belief becomes a shield. It's not about facts, it's about identity. You don't betray the revolution. You are the revolution. That's what makes resistance to the truth so powerful. It's not just psychological, it's cultural. Everyone around you is repeating the same lines. Everyone's still wearing the symbols. Everyone still believes, or at least pretends to. And if you're the one who questions it, you're suddenly suspect. You become what the revolution warned about. A traitor, a threat. A reminder that maybe nothing really changed. Social pressure locks it in. No one wants to be the first to say the emperor has no clothes, especially when the crowd is still cheering. And the new regime knows this. That's why the first thing it captures isn't just the weapons or the banks, it's the narrative. It takes over education, media, language itself. It redefines loyalty. It reclassifies truth. Over time, the population starts repeating phrases they don't fully believe, just to stay safe. And once that reflex sets in, real resistance dies before it starts. What remains is theater. Dissent becomes controlled. Opposition becomes symbolic. Elections are held, but the outcome is known. Free speech exists, but only within invisible fences. People still talk, but only about safe things. The slogans keep playing, but the meaning drains out. And still, most don't see it. Because to see it would mean admitting they were wrong, that they were played, that maybe the dream they fought for was never built. That takes more courage than most revolutions ever produce. So the system keeps moving, not because everyone agrees, but because enough people stay silent. Not because the new rulers are righteous, but because their tactics work. And because deep down, the people are tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of hoping. Tired of starting over. So they settle. They normalize. They survive. and the next cycle begins. Tyranny rarely walks in with boots and chains. It arrives quietly, through policy, through language, through comfort. The real shift doesn't happen when the revolution ends or when the new flag is raised. It happens later, when the population stops asking questions, when the urgency fades, when the resistance loses its edge. That's when control takes root, not in chaos, but in routine. At first, people are alert, sensitive to overreach, ready to push back. But over time, the lines blur. What was once temporary becomes permanent. What was once emergency powers becomes standard operating procedure. Surveillance stays, laws tighten, new bureaucracies form, and slowly the people adjust. They start using new phrases, not because they believe them, but because it's easier, safer. They learn which topics to avoid, which jokes not to make, which opinions cost too much. The shift is internal, cultural, behavioral, not enforced through violence, but through design. The most effective regimes don't rely on force. They rely on predictability. They build systems that train people to comply without being told. Schools teach the right kind of history. News outlets frame the same narrative, just in different colors. Algorithms show you what you're supposed to see. Dissent becomes not just rare, but invisible. This is the real trick. Power doesn't need to crush you. It just needs you to forget it's there. And once enough people forget, the regime becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't have to fight revolutions anymore. It digests them. It learns their symbols, adopts their slogans, and rebrands itself as the next stage of progress. The face looks different. The structure hasn't moved. That's the quiet shift. It's not loud, it's not sudden, it's not even obvious. But once it settles in, it's nearly impossible to undo. Because by then, most people have built their lives around it. Careers, families, beliefs, identities. Pulling at the thread would mean unraveling too much. So they leave it alone. And the new tyranny, no longer called tyranny, continues. More polished, more accepted, harder to name. And because it's harder to name, it's harder to fight. That's the genius of the system. It doesn't resist revolution. It absorbs it. It turns protest into policy. It rewrites the language of freedom so well that even critics start using it. It turns rebels into functionaries, radicals into brand ambassadors, and dissent into controlled opposition. You don't need tanks in the streets when the public polices itself. You don't need a dictator when everyone carries the system in their pocket. The architecture of control no longer looks like barbed wire. It looks like choice, like safety, like order. And by the time people realize they've been captured again, there's no moment of shock. No dramatic reveal, just a quiet awareness that nothing really changed, that the fight they thought they won was just the start of something else. And that maybe this, whatever it's called now, is the new normal. There's a rule no one says out loud, but everyone follows. You can challenge power, but you can't dismantle the game it plays. That's the limit baked into every revolution. You can name names, burn symbols, rewrite constitutions, but you can't touch the underlying contract. The belief that some group must always rule over everyone else. That society needs hierarchy. That control, so long as it's on your side, is acceptable. This is the foundation that never gets questioned. The assumption that power must be centralized, that governance requires obedience. That order means someone decides and the rest comply. We've been trained to see this as natural, necessary, even moral. So even when people rise up, they don't aim for freedom. They aim for better management. They don't dismantle the throne, they repaint it. The unspoken rule is that revolution is allowed, but only if it stays within certain lines. Only if it doesn't threaten the architecture. You can protest injustice, but don't question the system that makes injustice possible. You can criticize the ruler, but don't ask why anyone needs a ruler at all. And most don't, because even rebels fear chaos. Even freedom fighters want stability. They think in terms of who should be in charge, not whether being in charge is the problem. They fight to flip the pyramid, not flatten it. This is why revolutions reproduce tyranny. Not by accident, by design. Because they change the players, but not the rules. And the rules favor control. This unspoken rule is protected by language. We're told some people are qualified to lead, some aren't. That authority is earned. That power, if given to the right hands, is safe. But history doesn't back that up. Over and over, those qualified hands close the fist. Because the structure demands it. Every regime needs compliance. Every government wants continuity. So even idealists once in power start compromising. They accept trade-offs. They justify silence. They become administrators of the very thing they once fought. And if they don't, they get removed. The system doesn't punish corruption. It punishes disobedience. The unspoken rule makes sure of that. It rewards those who play the game well, who adopt its logic, who enforce its norms while pretending to reform them. It offers them legitimacy, resources, protection. It absorbs them, and the public, exhausted from decades of betrayal, settles for appearances. A new flag, a new anthem, a new name on the building. Anything to believe things are better, even if they're the same. This is how the cycle continues. Not because people don't care, but because they've been trained not to question the frame, not to ask, why is this structure always necessary? Who benefits from keeping it intact? What would it actually mean to live without someone above you deciding how your life should go? Those are the questions no revolution asks. Because the moment you ask them, you're not leading a revolution anymore. You're dismantling a belief system. And belief systems fight back harder than any regime. You don't need to lead a revolution to understand how power works. You just need to pay attention. Start with language. Watch how leaders speak. Notice the words that repeat: security, unity, progress. Ask yourself who defines those terms and who benefits when they're enforced. Pay attention to what's being said, but more importantly, to what's being left out. Look at structure. Who makes decisions? Who's allowed to question them without punishment? If the answer is no one, or if the criticism always circles back to the same acceptable targets, you're inside a closed system. Watch for normalization. When a government rolls out new powers, ask if they ever roll them back. When a crisis ends, does the surveillance stop? Do the emergency measures expire, or do they become the new standard? These are the pressure points. If people stop noticing them, the system grows stronger. Learn to separate symbols from systems. A revolution might take down a statue, rename a street, or elect a new face, but the core structures of control often remain untouched. Don't be distracted by surface changes. Look for institutional ones. If the same levers still exist, someone will use them. Resist false binaries. Most regimes survive by creating teams. Us versus them. Loyalist versus dissenter. Left versus right. These divisions make it easier to manage the population. As long as you're fighting your neighbor, you're not questioning the system itself. Practice intellectual independence. That doesn't mean becoming a contrarian. It means not outsourcing your judgment. You don't need to react instantly. Take time. Read beyond headlines. Notice when you're being emotionally pushed into certainty. Step back. In your own life, question where you seek control and why. Tyranny doesn't just live in governments. It lives in workplaces, families, communities, anywhere hierarchy is taken for granted. Ask yourself where you're compliant out of fear, not principle. And ask where you're repeating the logic of power, even with good intentions. Build parallel ways of thinking. Read outside the mainstream. Study history that didn't make it into the official version. Not to become paranoid, but to develop range. Most people don't lack intelligence. They lack context. And finally, understand this isn't about purity. You're not going to dismantle every system you touch. You live in the world. You need to survive. But you can move differently inside it. You can stay awake while others sleepwalk. You can spot the patterns before they harden. Control doesn't require your belief, it only needs your participation. Withdraw that even quietly, and you begin to shift something real. Not out there, in here. Every generation believes it will be the one to break the cycle. That, with enough passion, enough clarity, enough blood, the outcome will be different. But history doesn't bend under hope. It moves under pressure, and pressure follows design. Revolutions don't fail because people are weak. They fail because the structures they rise against remain standing long after the chants go quiet. Because most movements stop at replacement, not removal. That's the trap. Not the dictator, not the regime, the frame around them both. You can scream for change, vote for new leaders, even tear down governments. But unless you question the architecture, nothing changes. The house just gets a fresh coat of paint. And from the outside, it looks like progress, until you walk back in. So maybe the real revolution isn't loud. Maybe it doesn't march or trend or declare. Maybe it doesn't end in victory or collapse or fire. Maybe it just starts when one person sees the system for what it is and decides not to carry it forward. Not with their voice, not with their vote, not with their hands. Just a quiet refusal. A different rhythm. And over time, enough of those, small, unannounced, unclaimed, might matter more than the next revolution ever could. You don't need a flag to resist. You just need to stop mistaking the chair for the person sitting in it.